Welcome back to Beyond the Play, a show where we observe and discuss the connections between sports and real-world issues. Alongside Noam Watt, I'm Keegan Brown. Joining us once again is Professor Doug Glanville, a former professional baseball player for the Chicago Cubs and Philadelphia Phillies, as well as a distinguished journalist and commentator. He is currently a professor for the University of Connecticut's Sport Management Department. Professor Glanville, thank you so much for joining us today. We're thrilled to have you on the board for another season of Beyond the Play.
Yeah, Keegan, great to be here, and hopefully everybody's doing well this semester.
Absolutely. So let's get right into it. Nearly a year has passed since the NCAA revised its policy on student athletes earning money off their name, image, and likeness. Now we're seeing multi-million-dollar deals from major corporations like Nike, Chipotle, and StockX being made with college athletes. While the NIL deals may provide a new form of income for student athletes, they also do lead to a new form of stress in an already busy life. In many cases, the athletes are obligated to post on social media feeds regularly, promoting the brands they've signed to. In addition, they're filming commercials and meeting with brand executives on top of all their other priorities when it comes to sports and being a student. So Professor Glanville, my question for you, with all of the benefits that come with student athletes signing NIL deals, is it worth having their mental health impacted with all of the added responsibility?
Well, great to be here, Noam. I would say that, there's not ever a great trade-off if you're compromising mental health. So, it's the challenge of balance that we all face, and recognizing that we're still sort of working through a pandemic. Those obligations, can create a lot of pressure. There's no question about it. And, I always think of my career as, becoming a junior, getting drafted, then entering the pro ranks. And there was a lot to navigate, even as a 20-year-old going to turning 21, understanding about managing the professional life. Now, the thing that was good about baseball in some ways is that you slowly marched your way to the major leagues if you were to make it. So you have all these stops along the way where you're not quite in this bright spotlight. But in college, when you're especially at these top programs and the money at stake that, NIL may create, these contracts, as you mentioned, with Chipotle and so on, then you're already thrust out there where you're a public figure in a sense, and certainly they're paying for that access. They're paying for your time. So how do you work with an athlete to learn how to schedule and balance things? I had a lot of communication with, major league players, my agent, to try to work through, okay, how do we figure out what's too much? And so I think there was a huge advantage to the model in baseball that, and I'm not encouraging that the minor leagues shouldn't make more money, but I am saying that the ease at which and the sort of graduation slowly making it sort of felt like there was proportional to learning how to navigate those stressors. So that's a concern. I think NIL still opened up some doors, but at the same time, like any new initiative, you have to be mindful of how it's impacting these players, and they need the support to make sure they can do it in a balanced way and in a healthy way.
So this past fall, here's what UConn women's basketball head coach Gino Auriemma had to say on his team's NIL deals.
So hopefully they can perform at a level that they want to perform at and not get caught up in this other stuff.
So how did you as an athlete balance your on the field play with your off the field commitments? You talked about sort of rising through the minor league ranks. It's more of a gradual process than we've seen in college with the NIL, but there's still, I'm sure, an adjustment period. What did you do to manage those commitments and make sure that what you're doing off the field still allows you to perform at your highest on it?
Well, often I learned the hard way in many ways. And that's, although there's mentorship, which is important, I think the counsel that's around you is critical in these moments. Now, baseball being different, I would say most of these marquee sports, the big money generating sports, football, basketball, and so on, they're going to get that pressure right away. I mean, some of these, kids are signing right before you get out of high school. I mean, they're high school athletes. So you have that kind of challenge where you're barely put the basketball in your hands as a college athlete, and you're already dealing with this kind of pressure. So that is tough. And one direct example I had, and this wasn't even from sort of financial benefits, but it was an example of time management. When I first got traded to the Phillies, and I was 27 years old, I got traded to the Phillies from the Cubs. And when I got there, I remember I went to Penn and Philly. So I was a kind of the hometown kid. And so I was asked to do everything under the sun. And I said yes to everything because I'm like, yeah, I'm so excited to be here. And when I played, by the time I got to September at the end of the season, I mean, as Terry Francona, my manager, said, the bat was swinging me. I wasn't swinging the bat. I was so tired and exhausted because I was like, yes to this, yes to this, yes to this. So now add to the fact that I was saying yes to things that I wasn't even getting paid for. It was all community service. Now add to actual obligation, contractual obligation. That's a different kind of pressure. And so it took time to figure out the balance point. So the next year, which was 99, my default was no. And then I worked my way into things that I wanted to do and felt like I could balance off. And it was a much better time. But I made that adjustment at 28. I'm trying to imagine kids that are 18, 19, superstar athletes that have to, who are still learning after their first year how to balance classes and their athletic commitment. So I see a whole open possibility of having a support system specifically for this, or whatever agent they may have. They have an obligation to make sure these student athletes are taken care of.
Right. And we've already seen some of the effects that come with the NIL deals here in stores, with Paige, Bueckers, and Azzi Fudd making some pretty big deals with some significant brands. Paige is signed with StockX, Cash App. Azzi is signed with Chipotle, Bartleby, TIAA, American Eagle, and most notably Steph Curry's organization. And as we know, head coach Gino Auriemma has a lot to say on this topic, specifically how it affects their commitments on and off the court. He went on to say that the NIL landscape is top-heavy, meaning one or two athletes on a team will sign major deals while the rest are left watching from the sidelines. So, Professor Glanville, if you were a coach of a Division I team with athletes of all different status, all different calibers, sort of like what we have here in UConn, what would you do to maintain sort of a healthy team dynamic among these athletes?
Well, it's a great question. And I would say that some of the elements of what make a great coach can flow through navigating this challenge. Because as a coach, a good manager of people, you're figuring out people from all different backgrounds, walks of life, conditions, socioeconomics, and trying to figure out how to unify. Now you have this sort of economic disparity. And that's another thing to navigate, whether it's jealousy or tension or all those things. And so I think the skill sets are similar in some ways, but to navigate it may take some new knowledge, right? New knowledge and new wisdom about how to understand the impacts of that. First of all, you have star players that, have all these obligations that may take them away from things that they need to get done. And we talked about the mental health questions. You have, athletes that are not necessarily getting these deals. And so, what I see at times is if you have an NIL scenario where it's also related to the university where you're playing. Certainly if you're a football athlete at University of Alabama, you're going to just get different opportunities than if you're at Coppin State or something like that, right? So that there's a difference just by the environment you're in. So I think those programs should also be uniquely skilled to understand that the stakes are going to be different amongst their stars versus others, because their stars are literally national stars. They're not just stars on their own team. And so, once again, new horizons. I'm happy to see the athletes getting recognized and compensated in certain ways of their value. But it's a challenging landscape, and it doesn't necessarily lift the sort of obligations and responsibility for, say, the NCAA or the universities to say, well, okay, they're getting paid, they're getting handled. Now we just kind of move on, because there's still so much support that is necessary in this. So I think a good coach, good manager has to get ahead of this. Otherwise, it could eat your team alive by just knowing that one player is getting X and another isn't, and their focuses are not in the same place.
Yeah, totally. It's a challenge for coaches, and the best coaches will adapt, and coaches who aren't the best will struggle. And we're going to see a changing landscape over the next few years in college. We're going to see a lot more athletes maybe go to bigger schools, knowing that they can get bigger NIL deals. But as we've talked about a couple of times, that could impact mental health of athletes. And this is where I want to connect it to sort of a more, digestible conversation for students and for our community, right? A lot of us are struggling with mental health things, whether we're, facing depression and anxiety from the pandemic, or schools catching up to us and we're having trouble balancing social life. Now these student athletes are having to manage all of that with these commitments, these monetary commitments, or, otherwise if they're getting gear or stuff like that. And in sports nowadays, it's becoming more and more mainstream and acceptable to talk about mental health, whether it's Kevin Love, Simone Biles, Naomi Osaka being some of the athletes to use their platforms to eradicate the stigma surrounding mental health by sharing their stories with depression and anxiety, or, just in general. It's just part of our daily conversation more and more each day. And I think that's a good thing. I want to ask you, as a former professional athlete, could you just talk to us about some of the effects that mental health had on you or on your former teammates? Would you say that sports serve as a tool to help yourself or your former teammates cope with those symptoms of mental health issues? Or would sports contribute to those feelings and make it more difficult?
Well, I go back to the support. Not feeling alone is a big part of just trying to navigate this and having good resources around you. But we all deal with it differently. And, internalize things you may not share, you may not trust, all these things play a role in it. And, why it's so personal for me is my father was a psychiatrist. So I grew up in a house where my dad talked very often about these challenges, and I had a certain sensitivity and awareness of it. And just understanding that way back when I was, this is many years ago, growing up in Teaneck, New Jersey, and just having a certain understanding and appreciation for the importance of it, of mental health. So I see now, when you mention athletes, well, when you're dealing with really young players, like I was a pro when I got drafted, it took me a long time to make it. Well, now you're professionalized so young. And even if you're not on NIL and all this, you might be 15 and be a star basketball player, and you already have an Instagram and 200,000 followers. I mean, it's a lot of pressure to live up to something that is so ethereal and so hard to, wrap your arms around. And I think when you have that challenge of the ghostliness of holding on to it, or the time sensitivity around everything, you realize that this doesn't just give you peace. Just because you signed a 7-figure deal doesn't just solve your problems. And it's hard to talk about that, because just like we talked about the echelons on your own team, well, are you going to be sympathetic to someone that just signed a 7-figure deal with Chipotle? And so the person who gets these deals say, well, I can't talk about this because, I'm doing better than so many other people, right? So it's easy to turn inward and not feel like there's people around who will understand it. And part of it is out of your own sensitivity to know that there is certain gifts and advantages to the fact that you are this sort of NIL athlete. So that's a culture that needs to also shift. And so much of it is as we're learning more about mental health. And I think it's a great thing that these athletes are talking about it and opening up and dispelling this idea that, oh, you're Simone Biles, so everything's great. I think that's, important. And keep in mind, when you're on the stage, everything about you is amplified. And it's not just the money and the fame, it's also the demons and the things you feel internally, and the questions about, oh my goodness, if I don't score 30 this game, I might lose my scholarship, whatever it is. You just have a lot of things that are actually in the public domain. And it's really painful to think you might fall while you're in the public domain. And so, yeah, the more people are talking about it, sharing, getting resources, I mean, it validates, my childhood, just thinking about what my dad was able to accomplish. And he would tell you, you can't magically solve these things. Like it's like lifelong work. It isn't like, oh, here's one thing and, oh, everybody's just fine and happy. You just have to be, it's like we work out to, get stronger with our, biceps, right? You have to work at it and be healthy. And I'm glad that we realize that it isn't just a physical thing. I love those commercials, by the way. I forgot what company it is, but right now I've seen it with guys. The guy was lifting weights, and then the bar, it gets on his chest, and he's like, oh no, I'm fine. And they're like, do you need any help? He's like, no, I'm good. And he has 300 pounds of weights on him. Or the cowboy that gets bit by this rattlesnake. And he's like, oh, my grandpappy never got a doctor. And my father never got a doctor. I don't need a doctor. And meanwhile, a rattlesnake had bitten him. So those are great commercials, because they give you the analogy of the physical with the mental, and realizing that we have to approach it with the same seriousness.
Right. Great closing thoughts. It's definitely an important topic. And like you said, even though these athletes are sort of larger than life to the fans, they still go through the same struggles that many of us do, and I think it's important to sort of spread this awareness that, it's okay to not feel okay. And, you know, you're not alone in these mental health struggles. And, you know, I think it can be said that, you know, I think we should be putting on, you know, the same emphasis on mental health as we do physical health, especially for athletes. So, you know, it's a very interesting topic, very important topic in today's society. Professor Glanville, thank you again for joining us. And on behalf of Noam Watt, myself, and the crew here at UCTV Sports, we thank you all for tuning in to this episode, Beyond the Play.
Thank you.